Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to Moral Panic with me, your host, Christian Watson, and my co host, Nico J, where we discuss various issues relating to American culture, politics, and general things going on from our unique perspective. I appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate all of you, being willing to watch us and engage with us as well in this sort of civic product, I like to call it, where we think about deeply about the things affecting American society and we attempt to bring up some solutions from uncommon angles. So, as I always say before I begin one of these shows, hello, Nico J. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing, Christian?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Our country's been in a state of turbulence recently, it appears.
Yeah,
It's been going through some really rough stuff, which I'm sure we're going to have great occasion to talk about throughout our conversation today.
right. I think I always have an interest in some ways of like a meta interest, taking it one layer. But before we go too deep, we'll just start with the service stuff that's in the news, basically. And its first topic of the day is the No Kings protest, which have occurred in the past, but it seems like it was an organized effort to have it again this year. And so that happened, I believe it was yesterday, frankly. So it's pretty fresh
Yeah.
in the news. And there's interesting kind of back and forth. Like, the first time it happened, I don't think the right was really reacting. I don't think the Republicans really reacted much. But, maybe being how much Democrats are investing in this protest movement, there seems to be some reactions on the right, and we thought we would chime in and offer our opinions and pretty much it has to do with your opinion on the state of U.S. Republic. That's pretty much what we're going to try to discuss as well and see is the left, as they often do, overreacting, but sometimes we have issues with the reactions on the right as well. So we're gonna you know analyze it thoroughly, hopefully.
Certainly. And I'll say this: I actually, so the No Kings. I think that it was earlier. It was earlier this year they actually did a I think July they actually did a protest.
Right.
The first No Kings, and I was at my local one. I went to my
Mm-hmm.
local one. I think I might have actually even posted pictures in the Discord because I was really curious. I wanted to see, okay, what is the what is the logical implications of the progressive fascination with the current president? What does that look like? And what arguments do they make to justify their fascination? Those are the two questions in my mind as I actually went to that protest. And what I saw was what didn't give me a lot of clarity. What I saw were a lot of people who were speaking with anger. There was a strong habit towards mockery there, a strong habit towards mockery. Many of them decided it was better fit to mock their political opponents and actually go through the positions of their political opponents. There was a lot of exaggeration, a lot of alarmism, a lot of things that just really don't give much material for the thinking person to excavate into the deeper implications of a topic, but instead simply give the ideologue succor to believe that their unwell thought out of positions are actually correct when in all reality they are not correct. I think one of the things they did at that protest, they actually like sang a happy birthday song to Donald Trump because it was his birthday on the day of the
Oh,
protest.
right.
Yeah, they said they sang
Interesting.
a happy birthday song to him with next to the nursery rhyme. It was really peculiar stuff. I saw a lot of guys in masks there. Um, they looked like they had like bulges sticking out of the side of their overcoats, which makes me think that they probably had some kind of firearms hidden within there. That was
Interesting.
kind of scary. In fact, I have not spoken about this even to you privately, but I'll actually say it to people now. I was there with a family member, and there are these two guys in masks who I'm almost entirely sure, I don't know for sure, but I'm almost entirely sure they were Antifa. They were standing behind me the whole time because I wasn't acting outwardly disapproving of the situation, although inwardly you should have seen it. Inwardly, it was just ridiculous. But I was simply sitting there with my arms crossed like this, as I normally do, being
Hmm.
pensive about the whole thing. So these two guys in bandanas, masks, they come behind me because they noticed this, and they're staring at me. And my family member actually had to tell me, because when I'm focused on ideas, I'm in the arena of the mind. My mind is going, it's focusing forward. Everything around me becomes relevant, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing. It can be a bad thing because that posture puts you in a place where your imagination and your contemplation have no limits within the real world to be checked against, which is bad. That leads to idealism. But it can be a good thing because it allows you to focus. And focusing is the first principle that allows you to achieve sound moral refinement, so on and so forth. So anyway, I was in tunnel vision and I was just looking at these protests. And there were these two guys in mass right behind me. And my family member was like, Christian, look behind you. He was like just doing it with his head. I'm like, what do you mean look behind? So I look behind me and they're like, sure, lo and behold, these like two, I'm almost entirely sure they were Antifa. These two white dudes with their face covered, with glasses and everything, looking at me. I'm like, oh.
Jeez.
And so we decided to test out if they were actually looking at me or somebody else. So we moved from that spot that I was at. When we moved from that spot that I was at, guess what?
They moved too.
They moved too.
Jeez.
So you guys might have been talking about Christian Watson in the past tense if I hadn't watched up.
Yeah, it's good to have somebody watching your back.
I only half joke because those kinds of people have no respect for life. They are not rightly ordered people. They have no respect for justice. They have no respect for anything except the imposition of their ideology through arbitrary will and violence upon the rest of the society. So you can't deal with those people the same way you deal with someone who has a measured disagreement with you. So anyway, that was my last experience at the No Kings protest that happened in like the summer. So after that, I said no more, and so I did not go to the protest yesterday. I was, first of all, I was working, but second of all, even I hadn't been working, I just didn't have any interest. I think these things, Nico J.
Yeah.
Like, you know how a river has like, when it's at high tide and it's like really just rolling down and it's really, really intense. Mm-hmm. Well, rivers don't remain that way forever. Rivers eventually go back to a calm posture where they're actually navigatable, right? Rivers that are on high tides not navigatable. If you get on a raft or anything in that river, you'll likely capsize, you'll turn over, the currents will take you in, or you'll drown, you'll hit a rock. The bad things will happen. But when the river is calm, you can actually navigate it with ease and precision. And I see these kinds of protests as the river being at high tide. And if you are not part of that river system, if you're not part of the high tide, and you're instead attempting to just drift along, you're going to get taken under. I think that's true in a lot of cases. And so I like to watch the tide. I like to watch the rushing river. I like to watch the cascading waters and ask myself, what about this can I glean in terms of how I view the condition of our society, in terms of how I view my own role as a citizen in addressing these kinds of bursts of expression, as I call them. So I prefer not to be in the middle of that stuff, because in the earlier part of my career, this is a career. I think this is a career. I will say it's a career. Mm-hmm. It might be presumptuous, but I'll say it's a career. In the early part of my career here as a content creator, I used to actually be very much interested in going into the middle of protests with people that don't have any regard for life, and doing these kind of things for the purposes of getting content and hopefully maybe even getting my message out there in a way that's a little bit more direct. I mean, I'll give you an example if you want to hear. It's when Alex Stein, remember him? When he Penn State in Pennsylvania. This is the first time he went there. A bunch of local Antifa were mad. They didn't like it very much. So they staged a big protest. Well, at the time, Alex Stein and I were friends. We are no longer friends. I won't elaborate, but we're no longer friends. And I said, you know what? My friend is coming to Penn State. You know, I like Pennsylvania. I'm a native of Pennsylvania. Why don't I actually just go and support him? So I go to Penn State. And I walk up towards the building that he's hiding his event at. Now, the interesting thing is that a few feet from that building, before you even see it, all you hear are yells and screams. That was the anger of the crowd around him. Again, that cascading river, that high tide, all you hear, like, I had people looking at me on the way to the event. I asked them, "Where's that event at?" And there's one college kid's like, you sure you want to go there, man? Please be careful." What? Someone's coming to speak on a college campus in America, and I'm being met with warnings.
Yeah.
I'm not being met with like subtle encouragement or just basic directions. I'm being met with warnings. That's the first time I knew something was wrong. Then I actually get to the building he's actually going to speak at, and I see him in the middle of a crowd making silly faces, doing what he does, being provocative. And these kids are all clad in black bloc. They like are just clad in black clothing. They're using the black bloc tactic, which is endemic to the nature of Antifa. And they're screaming at him. They're yelling at him, yelling obscenities at him. So me being the daring young man that I am, I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and get right in the middle of this. So I run to the middle of the crowd. I got next to Alex Stein. I held my phone up, and I began recording everything. And I was basically right next to him. People can go find pictures of this. Happened like back in like 2023, I think. I was basically right next to him with my phone up while these Antifa kids were just screaming and foaming at the mouth. And many people may remember, actually, there was a girl, like a young high school girl that was at that protest for some reason, and she spit on his lapel, and it got stuck. I was actually right next to him when it happened. I hadn't seen it, but when I turned towards him, I saw the spit there. I'm like, oh my. So we had to be rushed into the building because the kids there were screaming and throwing their hands in our faces, and we had to be barricaded in there. Ultimately, the event did not happen that night because the building became surrounded. Police had to come out with cavalry. It was terrible. And we had to be snuck out the back door like something out of Grand Theft Auto and rush towards the parking decks where we had parked. That's how bad things were. They were gathered around the doors. They were banging on the doors, trying to break in past the police barricade. If the cops hadn't been there that night, I think someone would have got egregiously hurt. This is on a college campus in America. So I think at this point in time, people ask me, Christian, why don't you do more on-the-ground journalism? Well, first of all, I'm not an on-the-ground kind of person. I like to observe what's happening on the ground, but I don't need to be the person generating what's happening on the ground. Number one. Number two, my gifts are best used when I can contemplate. And my contemplation is at its heights when it is in a quiet and a quiet and controlled environment. I can't contemplate. I can't give insight if I'm fighting for my life. So that's why I personally avoid going to those kinds of things anymore. I just don't think it's worth the risk. And I also think that thinking person is better to sit back and look at the event rather than actually get involved himself in most cases. So there's my TED Talk for the day.
Yeah. No, that's a crazy experience. I've been fortunate to not run into Antifa. I've been to a couple events. I didn't go yesterday either. I think I probably didn't miss much. It probably would have been the same atmosphere that I saw before, a relatively suburban, it just comes across as a mostly Democrat type of outrage rally that we don't like the president that's in charge. And that was actually going to be my question. To what extent do you think that some of these rallies or the organized protest itself is just a complaint against the current president, which they've done in the first administration? There was a lot of protests. I mean, it was a slightly different dynamic part of timeline then, but it just feels like it's pre-midterm type of momentum that the Democrats are trying to capitalize on. And, it's good that they believe in a republic. The majority of the right has no interest in dismantling the republic. So it does seem like it's, at the very least, we can agree that we believe in republicanism. but it does seem like Democratic outrage. We don't like who's in charge because, I'll leave it up to you to continue this train of thought. But frankly, I think it's going a little too far, and it's politics as usual.
Yeah. So I think you made some very astute observations there. So I think there are several elements to this sort of string of protests we're seeing. There's the more practical element, which is there are a bunch of progressive NGOs that have a market interest in getting up momentum for the National Democratic Party ahead of the midterms that are going to be by this time next year. The midterms will be like a month or so away. So the midterms are right around the corner, politically speaking, and there are a lot of people that need to gen up social momentum because momentum can lead to social capital, and social capital can lead to political capital, and political capital, according to conventional wisdom, can lead to electoral victories. Not just electoral victories, but cultural victories as well. Because, by the way, look, there have been periods of time where certain parties have held majorities in both houses, and the country culturally was still not on their side. Think about 2006. 2006, I believe the Democrats held control over Senate and House. I think Nancy Pelosi was the speaker at the time, actually. So she was the third most powerful person in the government at that time, which is a really interesting thought. But culturally, you still had a very conservative country in 2006, compared to now, at least, most certainly compared to now. So I don't believe that an electoral victory will always reflect the state of the culture. In fact, I believe that electoral victories unfortunately shape culture more than they reflect culture. And this is why I believe that the idea that politics is downstream of culture, which is oftentimes said, it is applies a half-truth to a general issue that demands more of an answer. Politics is not totally downstream of culture. In fact, politics can shape culture if the wrong people get into power, people who have no fidelity towards the cultural values and principles of the country they're supposed to serve. We see this happen evidently all the time. And I think a good example of this is the fact that a majority of the country, you could possibly say, is at least right of center or centrist. A majority of the country is not left wing. Left wing ideologies are concentrated in major city hubs
Right.
around the country, especially if you look at voting trends, that would seem to suggest that as well. So, but there have been times where we've elected presidents that are far more ideologically left wing than the country's actually is. Like, for example, Obama was definitely a case of this. So if politics was downstream of culture, you would hope that the president, the political identity of the president, would be consistent with the cultural makeup of the country, but this is not the case in many cases. So I think the better thing is that politics can shape culture if it is too extensive, and culture may be able to shape perceptions of politics if it is rightly ordered. But if culture is not rightly ordered and it's weaker than political authority, which I would even argue, ever since the progressive era came about, American culture has been made a secondary kind of thing compared to political authority, then culture cannot have the impact that it ought to have on politics. And that's the problem. That's the problem. Although it's very interesting. I view the relationship between culture and politics as the relationship between a parasite and its host, only in the sense that when election season comes around, politicians will take culture, they'll take upon certain cultural activities to gain favor in the minds of the voter without having any of the substance that a fidelity towards culture would demand. You've seen these politicians go out and do like barbecues and cookouts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Or you've seen these politicians go out and they go shopping at the grocery store. Mitt Romney famously did this. He went to the grocery store because he was being caught out of touch. So he went to a grocery store, filled his cart up with a bunch of stuff, and then was seen pushing it out the door because he wanted to show himself that he was the average American who goes to the grocery store. When in all reality, Mitt Romney's a multimillionaire and probably has someone go to the grocery store for him. But he wanted to show the perception of him being the average person or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, politicians will oftentimes use culture for the ends of obtaining power. But when power is obtained, culture becomes on the back seat. And this in the background of what I call the norms of power, which actually dictate how politics work in reality. So I kind of went on a tangent, but taking it back to our original conversation, um, so these protests, these No Kings protests,
Mhm.
are largely an attempt to use culture parasitically to embolden the Democrats'
Right.
chance of doing well in the midterms. But also, it speaks to something else that I think is even more concerning, and it speaks to what I call the expressive view of politics. So I talk a lot about expression in my content and in my work in general, because expression is one of those universal human acts that everyone exhibits and that also affects our politics and our society on a rather grand level. I'm engaging in a form of expression right now, the speaking of my views to people who are listening, talking and dialoguing with you. That's a form of expression. But also going out and yelling in the streets is a form of expression. But when politics is bound by expression, politics becomes more about performance and how well the performance is done, more than it comes about a substantive appraisal of the issues the government ought to be dealing with in our country. And when politics becomes about expression, you can no longer talk about anything without first measuring it against a hollow standard of performance. Policy can't be talked about unless it's talked about in terms of what group it benefits or what cause it furthers, so as to, in the mind of some people, make that policy more virtuous, right? Um, uh, Candidates can't be talked about unless they're talked about in terms of who they represent and what their candidacy does to break glass ceiling, so to speak, right? So on and so forth. They can't be talked about unless they talk about how American they are and how rough and tumble they are, and they're going to start talking in a country accent and wearing a cowboy hat and wearing some boots or whatever. Like that kind of stuff has been part and parcel to the American political experience because expression has become the center. Well, when you have a politics of expression, you get spectacle more than you get substance.
Mhm.
You get performance more than you get the solving of decisions. You get desire more than you get inquiry. And ultimately, you get a country that is governed by terrible standards and a government that reflects those terrible standards rather than a government governed by good standards, a government that reflects those good standards. And so these No Kings protests really reflect this crisis of expression, this tyranny of expression that I think has taken up too much power over our government and over our politics. There's two forms of expression. There's refined expression and then there's raw expression. I'll explain both in due course. Raw expression is that kind of unformed expression that simply exhibits the most basic forms of our expression. So, for example, raw expression would be you screaming, scream. It would be someone trying to sing but singing badly. It would be somebody dancing to a song. That's raw expression. It's not refined because it has no rhyme and reason, no method to make it serve a particular end, except just pure emotion or pure sentiment. Then you have refined expression. So refined expression would be someone singing an opera or someone playing an instrument according to the music sheet laid down before them, or playing the piano according to the notes laid down before them upon their dais. Making a well ordered, well articulated speech. This is refined expression, so on and so forth. Debating in a structured and ordered way is refined expression. Well, the problem is our politics of expression actually latches onto raw expression. And then, since there's no standard by which to make that a more broader thing and be sustainable, everyone partakes and begins thinking their views are the views that should prevail with no regard to substance. So I think that we need to refine our sense of expression in this country, or else you get more things like the No Kings, right? And the No Kings, right? The whole thing is that they believe Donald Trump is a king, and we have no kings in America. Therefore, let's be clever and say no kings. Well, This obviously reflects the sort of idea of raw expression, because raw expression is simply that kind of expression that is not directed, has no standard or method, and it can't reach substance. It can only reach pure emotion, as I just defined it. Therefore, you can say things that make no sense, but they'll make sense to you because within your expressive frame, they're logical. Whereas with refined expression, your expression now has to answer to a higher standard, and that higher standard becomes the basis upon which your expression is judged. So if refined expression was the kind of expression guiding American politics, you couldn't possibly say no kings, because there are no kings in the first place. But if it's just raw expression, you get to dictate the terms upon which your expression exists and the terms upon which you argue for ideas. Therefore, you can say no kings, no alligators, no unicorns in the sky, because your expression is the standard upon which discussion happens. I think the danger of raw expression is that it introduces relativism to our politics. That should worry all of us. So that's my thoughts on the no king people. I think they're unfortunate runaway results of the prevalence of raw expression within our society.
And it seems very myopic, I guess, just to prove the point that it is very one-sided. It's obviously one-sided, because I just remember a time when President Obama was doing executive orders, and even SNL would poke fun at it with that School of Rock parody. I don't know if you've seen that before.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
But, if someone were to say no kings then, it would just be cast aside as like another Tea Party protester. So, it's like they're commenting more. You could say it's related to some of his acts, but it seems like they have an issue more of his style, his personality, than the actual executive branch. It seems like it's more targeted against him. And of course, that gives him some license to laugh it off. And frankly, to steelman that argument, we would probably want the same Tea Party protesters that were calling Obama Stalin. We would want them to hold every executive accountable, that there is no double standard.
Certainly.
So I think our contention is that it's incredibly one-sided, and it's a machine, like you were saying, NGOs, the Democratic Party. It's a momentum movement of the left, and we haven't seen much value in it besides, observing it as electoral swings and momentum swings and things like that. I think we could segue to the next topic, because one of the contentions when people complain about this current administration, they keep using the phrase, we shouldn't be living in a time period where people are being disappeared off the streets. And it seems like another just great exaggeration of what's going on with the ICE raids. In fact, I saw some of the footage from Chicago where I guess people are now protesting ICE directly in front of them, and it's turning into kind of Antifa-style battles, or things we saw with the BLM riots and protests.
Some scary stuff happening.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities with like the BLM movements, and the more I think about it, the BLM movements and the whole anti-ICE movements. What are your thoughts on exaggerations and ICE complaints and things like that?
I mean, think about so BLM and a lot of the anti-ICE protests. Not only are they filled with some of the same ideologues, they also undertake the same tactics. They believe in the idea of direct action, going directly to those who they believe are the ones in power that are pulling the levers and doing the bad thing, and actually facing them on the streets in a way that is really aggressive, very visceral, very personal, and also a way that they believe will get their voices heard. Whether it's the BLM protests of the 2020s or even before then, because I'm old enough to remember when Freddie Gray in Baltimore, when that happened, and they burnt down the city. I remember when that happened. I was like in high school, I think, but I was watching the coverage. It was pretty vicious stuff. So even before George Floyd, there was a bunch of BLM what's that guy in Missouri I forgot what his name was. Michael Brown. Is that Michael Brown in Missouri? I think Ferguson.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I remember when that happened. That was 2014. I remember that happened. They literally burnt down the city. The city was just a miasma of orange flames. It was very disturbing
And
to
a bit
see.
before our time, there was LA riots as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That was Rodney King. Yeah, that was way before our time. It was like
Yeah.
the 90s. I wasn't even a thought back then. But some people watching may remember that time. And actually, I'm actually happy you brought up the Rodney King riots because uh, I think you saw a good practice in what it means to be a good citizen from the shop owners that defended their businesses during those riots. The Asian shop owners who went on the roofs with their rifles, who met would-be rioters at the door of their shops with their shotguns. A assertive citizenry is a rightly ordered citizenry, because an assertive citizenry is only citizenry that can assure, number one, that its rights are preserved, number two, that authority is checked, and even number three, that the excesses of those in the society are checked too. See, a lot of people believe that the citizenry is a sort of relationship, a one-sided relationship between the government and the citizen. It's not. It's actually a two-way relationship or a three-way relationship between the government, the citizen, and the society the citizen lives in.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone who lives in your society is not a citizen. People view citizenship as like a legal status, when in all reality, in America at least, it's fundamentally a moral and worldview status, not a legal status. So everyone that lives in your society, even if they bear the legal mark of citizenship, is not a citizen. So the measure of a good citizen is how well they keep close to first principles of morality, like fidelity. No society can exist if there is no loyalty and good faith and trust amongst its members, because trust defines the context that we exist in every day as people, whether it be as simple as us having bank accounts and trusting that our bank will not defraud us, or as simple as us going into a building and trusting that the people that built the building did not build it to fall, they built it to sustain. Fidelity is that without which society cannot be possible. So a citizen has to be especially concerned with the issue of fidelity, because the citizen is not simply worried about, per se, being a good neighbor. The citizen is also worried about, more generally, how does their loyalty actually keep together the Commonwealth as a whole, and what can they do in their own power to ensure that principle remains sustained and perpetuate as well in the life of their citizenry. Well, if someone rejects the idea of fidelity and they say, I'm going to let my raw expression, because remember, I just distinguished raw expression with refined expression for those of you who just joined. Raw expression is expression that is simply an exhibition of pure emotion, whereas refined expression is expression held to a standard higher than our emotion, even if the expression itself is an emotion. So the difference is raw expression is I scream just to scream, or I punch something out of anger. Refined expression is like an opera singer looking at a song sheet and singing out a beautiful song, so on and so forth. So the raw expression of the people in LA at the time that decided they were going to go ahead and burn down buildings met the refined expression of the citizen that said, no, fidelity matters. And if you seek to trespass that in a way that endangers me, I will stop you with force, which is a proportional response.
Just going to interrupt real quickly to highlight that our friend Bob gave a super chat.
Yes, indeed. Let me put it up here. Rooftop Koreans are my spirit animal. I guess, first of all, thank you for the money. Thank you sincerely. I'm always appreciative. I great interior. Thank you so much. And I also agree with you. They're mine as well. If I had one, they would be. If I had one.
It's hard to imagine them these days, though, with all the gun control, right? Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine. We went through a brief Kyle Rittenhouse phase, but it's hard to imagine in LA, in the suburbs of LA, wherever the rooftop Koreans were. It's hard to imagine that these days, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, certainly. Yeah, I've been to Los Angeles before, and unfortunately, I think it is as bad as people have said it is. There is a general culture of superficiality and artificial relationships that pervade that town, all the way down to the architecture. I made a video about how architecture can actually influence our moral imaginations. And I meant that seriously. Because our moral imagination is the compartment of our mind that allows us to envision the many different ways we can act in the right way, we can pursue right behavior and avoid wrong behavior. That's the moral imagination in a nutshell. And we get hints as to how to do this from the world around us through induction. Now, looking at a certain kind of building will not make you an evil person or a good person, obviously. But looking at a certain kind of building, depending on how the building is constituted, can heighten your imagination and therefore increase its ability to envision ways to do the right thing. If I look at a cathedral, my emotional reaction would be very different than if I look at a dilapidated building that should have been bulldozed 4 years ago, that is now being used as a trap house by some gangsters. My reaction would be very different, right? I might have one reaction of disgust, another reaction of inspiration. And Evan just makes a great point here. Yes, Evan, Soviet architecture was purposely done. Yeah, absolutely. This is a very, very brilliant point. Soviet art actually is a very good point, a very good example of this. Because art within the Soviet Union was so grotesque that there was actually a counter-artistic movement formed against it. I forgot what that movement was called. I mentioned it in that other video I talked about. But that counter-artistic movement itself, their paintings, their sculptures, their statues, were actually just as dull and just as lifeless as what they were responding to. And they didn't have the internet back then. They had very limited reference points. The moral imaginations of the Russians of that time was so depressed that even when they tried to venture into the creative realm to rebuke the sort of lifelessness of communist architecture, they couldn't go beyond the standards set for them. So the Soviets are actually a great example of how the moral imagination could be dulled by bad architecture. So I think that, where was I going with this, Nico? I go off on these.
We were talking about how essentially the environment could affect an individual.
Yes, in LA. Thank you. So when I was there, I very much didn't feel much inspiration from the buildings. I walked all up and down Hollywood Boulevard. I didn't feel much inspiration. I felt a feeling of alienation almost. I'm like, this seems so distant and so cold from what I'm used to. I didn't feel a lot of warmth, so to speak. I saw a lot of transactional relationships happening too on the streets. I actually went, not even sure I talked about this on the air, but I went to before it was shut down, I went to the Scientology field office in LA. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
And that might have put a bad taste in my mouth for the place even more, because Scientologists are just,
the existence of
they're one subset of people that I really, really think rationalize their way into their own prison. The prison of their delusion, seriously. And if there are any Scientologists watching, no offense, although I don't think I have any watching me, but if there are, no offense, that's just how I feel, based on everything I know about that belief system. But anyway, I saw, and funny enough, that building was probably actually the most artistically interesting building I saw in all of Los Angeles. But even that's not saying much, because I went to that building. It just seemed everything was like fantastical. It reflected the kind of futuristic architecture that is not like yet exists, but it almost felt like a cartoonish form of the future, if you know what I'm saying. Like, it seems so futuristic, but it also seems so unrealistic at the same time. And I'm just like, what am I going to do with this? Right? What am I going to do with this? There's not much I can do with this except just avoid it. So I think that for many reasons in general, Los Angeles, that entire area, has taken upon a cultural identity that discourages an assertive citizenry. And therefore, things that we saw, like the rooftop Koreans, That's not really going to happen too often, unfortunately.
What do you think? On the left, there's this network of people that will inform the community when ICE is arriving, and there's people like ringing cowbells and whatnot, ringing sorts of bells and trying to inform people. What do you think from their perspective? It's like they think that they are the hero saving the day with illegal immigrants, and to what do you think, or what is your response to that notion? This sort of like hero complex that some of these leftist activists have.
Well, I think a few things. In one sense, I think some of the tactics being undertaken by ICE don't look good from a justification standpoint. So there have been cases of like ICE pulling up to like illegals in like vans, jumping out, putting bags over their heads, and just like throwing them in the van and driving off. Now, I made a point in a past video where I said we can't mistake the justness and the rightness of an act for the means undertaken to obtain it. What do I mean? Deportation is a necessary and essential act to preserve civil society and to enforce fidelity amongst those who would seek to violate it by coming into our country against the standards, in violation of the standards that we have set down for their entry, governing the terms of their entry. Deportation, therefore, is necessary to enforce fidelity, to ensure justice, and to protect the country from those who would seek to uproot both of those by defying standards and existing in our country in a way that pleases them without any respect to broader moral rules. So let's put that at the side. Deportation is moral. But the way you go about deporting people can unfortunately compromise the moral act by making it seem immoral. So we have to separate a conversation when it comes to justification from means and ends. So if deportation as an end goal is moral, that's one thing. But if our means don't reflect that, that does not mean the end goal becomes immoral. That means we need to go ahead and find better means to obtain the end goal. And my criticism of ICE has been consistent in that I don't think, in terms of the issue of means, going out in vans and like throwing bags over people's heads does not respect the moral nature of the act being undertaken, does not respect the kind of dignity that I think all political order should be conducted against. So my constant suggestion has been for the Trump administration to revise their deportation strategy, to still pursue deportations vigorously and with a lot of passion and what they respect for the fidelity owed to the American people, but do so in a way that is less dystopic, that is less jarring, and that is more so in line with how a republic should operate its functions. That's been my criticism. And unfortunately, the ways that deportation is carried out gives a lot of fuel to the left for them to say, this is evil, this is terrible, this is fascism, when it's obviously none of those things. But if you give them plausible deniability, or in this case, plausible assertability, where they can assert something plausibly without having the evidence and substance to back it up, then you're essentially you're making their argument for them. Why would you do that? Why give your opponent more ground than they deserve by making errors in your own right? I think the pro-deportation position has the moral high ground, has the cultural high ground. Most Americans intuitively understand that every country has rules, and you have to follow those rules if you wish to stay there. Even without getting into the question of fidelity and deeper moral philosophy, most Americans understand this on a very basic level, intuitive level. So we already have the high ground. Why mess it up through unsound tactics is my thing. So I think that we've unfortunately enabled a lot of these left-wing activists who do not care about the preservation of our country, who do not care about restoring America to what it once was at the period of the founding in terms of its sort of moral and political foundations. Does not care. They care about remaking the country in their own image, and any vague appeal to the conscience of Americans they can make, they're going to do it, regardless of if they even believe that appeal is true, or even if they are going to follow the implications of that appeal through, should their project succeed. If you understand what I'm saying. So, excuse me. So this hero complex is entirely enabled, I think, by some of the unwise tactics. Now, having said that, even in the absence of these tactics, we have to admit they would still be saying bad things about deportations. And to that, I would simply say, you have to ask them a foundational question. What do they believe governs society? What do they believe sustains society? Is it boundless compassion, or is it fidelity? Let's use our powers of inquiry. Let's excavate in the civic here, and let's attempt to answer this question right here and now, Mr. Nikoji. Mm-hmm. If boundless compassion governs society, then a few problems arise. Number one, a problem of proper ordering. How do I determine who to be compassionate to if I have no sense of fidelity, of loyalty to one person or the other on the basis of our connection? The argument is that even if someone came into our country illegally and they are here against the ends of our country, we ought to forget that and be compassionate because their personal advantages or circumstances might be harmed if they were to be deported. So compassion is the moral standard. But how do I even establish the ability to be compassionate without a connection? And the only principle that assures a stable connection between two persons is what? Fidelity. So the compassion-only argument has already hit its first wall. I can't ensure a sound connection without a principle to guard that connection. If I can't be loyal to somebody or they can't be loyal to me, why would I even have a connection in the first place? Compassion does not ensure connection. Compassion ensures a posture of behavior that happens after connection is already established. You're putting the cart before the horse, literally. That's the first problem with the left-wing idea that compassion ought to be the center. But there's a second problem, and this problem is even a little bit more concerning. They're treating compassion as the only moral standard involved in the question of deportation, when in our reality, no moral standard exists in absence of other moral standards. Morality is an morality properly understood is an interlocking system where principles meet out other principles. They refine each other. They inform each other. Like all of the moving parts of a machine produce the forward motion of a machine like a car. There is no principle that exists totally in isolation. So if compassion is over here, there are other principles that exist over here as well that have to inform how compassion exists as well, both as a duty for us in society and also as a power principle in its own right. So when you eliminate every other principle that exists in favor of one, you are flattening a moral system to the point where you cannot give a justification for anything. You can only give an assertion. You can only give an assertion. So for those two reasons, I don't buy this. Well, we have to be compassionate towards the illegals. Well, I certainly think compassion is a good thing when put in the proper context. But compassion is no standard for governance. Governance is concerned with justice. Mm-hmm. And if the argument is that illegal immigrants deserve to have dignity, which they do, and therefore they deserve compassion, well, we have to really ask ourselves what it means for somebody to have dignity. Well, dignity, strictly taken, it means they get what they deserve. They get the treatment they deserve. Mm-hmm. Well, justice informs what exactly we deserve. If I'm unjust towards somebody else, I deserve correction for that injustice. Mm-hmm. If I'm just towards somebody else, I deserve praise for that moral behavior. So if the illegal immigrant broke justice by coming into the country against the standards of the country and then trying to stay in continued defiance against those standards and norms, then the dignified thing to do would be to deport them. That would also be the compassionate thing to do. Because if compassion reflects dignity, and then dignity reflects what we deserve, then there's an inherent connection between their just deserts and that compassion. So when you break down this in this way, by the way, what I just did, I call it excavating in the civic. I just literally dug into the foundations of our debate on a civic moral level, and I took the raw material and I just brought up my insights. Most people don't do that. Most people are content with a puddle-like level of discernment or understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Their understanding is like a puddle. They want to be entertained. This is where most people are. They want to be entertained. They want to have the sensation of pleasure come up when they see their favorite content creator in drama or saying stuff that they already agree with. They don't want to be refined or edified. But when you excavate in the civic, you have no choice but to be edified, because you are literally doing the work that it takes to go beyond everything you believe is true. It's why some people, when I talk to them, they are threatened by what I have to say, because they've believed some things their whole life. And when little old Christian Watson, little 25-year-old Christian Watson comes along and says, hey, maybe that's not wise. Well, how dare you? Who do you? You don't know anything. Who do you think you are? I don't know. Okay, all right. You just told me, by that behavior, you just told me you don't understand what it means to understand the substance of belief. You only have a familiarity with the feeling of belief. Because belief has a substance and also has a feeling. We feel that which we don't consider more strongly than we understand. So, for example, let's say that you were born into a household and your household had certain ways of doing things. And you go into your adult life not considering if those ways are right or wrong, or if they're efficient or inefficient, and you take that into your household. When you have kids, you do those same things. Then one day one of your kids say, hey, mommy or daddy, that thing you do, why do you do it? Well, who do you think you are? This is my household. What's your problem? I'm in my 50s. You're just a kid. That's what happens. It's a survival instinct directed towards the wrong source. Because what is not threatened is their life. What is threatened is their perception that they've refused to challenge. We have millions of people in this country existing in a place of unchallenged perception. Therefore, they could become uncomfortable when they receive new information. It feels foreign to them. So what do you have to do? You got to refine. You got to excavate. Got to dig. I'm gonna get a Minecraft shovel. I swear to you. I'm gonna buy one, and I'm gonna begin doing that. It's gonna be funny. So, anyway, I think to answer your question, I think those left-wing people are talking about the hero complex. Mm-hmm. They're refusing to excavate. They perceive politics on a level of feeling and habit, not on the level of substance, and that leads to misunderstandings of a lot of different things.
Right, I agree. And one of the reasons I made comparisons to BLM is because I saw in both that there is a need for reform in some of our law enforcement. They're basically both having to do with law enforcement, right? In this case, it's immigration law enforcement. And like you said, when people are acting on the surface level, they don't understand that there might be some reforms in agreement. People get all heated up in the surface level, and they don't arrive at that agreement. They end up doing these really tribalistic things, and they end up going out in the streets in front of officers, and next thing you know, they're tasting tear gas and things like that, and then that could further radicalize them, and the government's acting in heightened ways responding to radicals. So we have this like bad snowball effect, and we're not getting to the second layer agreements of reform that you would hope for in any sort of republic where
So
it would
hold
be
on. I'm sorry.
so. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Say that again. You said something about a second layer. Say that one more time, please, because you just changed everything by saying that. Please say
Yeah,
that again.
yeah. The second layer where it's no longer surface level, and people can come to they find the agreements. They might not agree on everything, but it's kind of like a bipartisan effort in the Senate, if you will. And there's an agreement on reform. So something happened. We agree that there could be some sort of reform, and we don't end up in the reform because we have these radicals protesting and people believing the surface layer stuff and not getting to the actual devils in the details and or the actual details of said reform that we could implement.
When you said the second layer, I smiled because most people never consider politics beyond the first layer.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, some people mistake politics entirely as the first layer. But to get to the second layer, you have to peel back or you have to excavate, either one.
Yeah.
And that takes work. It takes self-reflection, takes analysis, takes refinement, it takes a lot of things that are not comfortable to those who take the path of least resistance. And America's political order was not found upon the path of least resistance. America's political order was found upon tension, and tension met refinement, and refinement met and eventually resulted in civilization. So we have right now wide classes of people that don't want to get involved in that whatsoever. They want to simply stay on the level of feeling and stay on the level of the surface
Right.
and expression, but not get beyond that into substance. It's a problem.
It's slightly concerning the prospect of tribalism increasing every generation. That sometimes concerns me as corrupting our civic system. That politics should be a little more. It's some people like to use the phrase "make politics boring again," and at some level, I think that's what we're getting at to some degree. But we also meet them at the culture. We're doing both. It's a balancing act.
I mean, Grover Cleveland, someone I know we both admire deeply.
Mm-hmm.
He conducted politics in a way that many would consider boring. But in doing so, he was rigorously principled and reflected the best of the country. So we need to have much more of that and much less of spectacle. Because spectacle only sustains us for a moment. Principle will sustain you for a lifetime. Spectacle only sustains you for a moment. Principle will sustain you for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we forget the difference between spectacle and principle, or we try to mix and match both and treat them as one and the same, which leaves us defenseless to the ravages of spectacle, and even more defenseless to the now weakened understanding of principles that we have, that then inform our behavior and then make it weak. It's a problem on two fronts. Yeah, this is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it characterizes why I'm happy we're doing this show. It characterizes why I talk the way I talk. Because I'm trying to contribute to something bigger,
Yeah.
Because, Nikoji, a lot of folks will say to us, they listen to this conversation and they'll say, well, you guys are so idealistic. Politics has always been tribal. Politics has always been emotional. What's wrong with you? I mean, no one's going to sit here and listen to deep philosophy, all this kind of stuff. And I just really, I lament those kind of people. I really feel sorry for them. Because they live life in such an impoverished way. Like their version of living life is like trying to drink from a well that's dried up, that can offer them no water. They're thirsty all the time because they have nothing to sustain them except the sugar high they get from the fast food of politics, from the spectacle, the drama, the nonsense that for a moment feels all good and everything. Everyone's so heightened and impressed, but then after that moment, it goes away. And I'm here carrying a bucket of fruit and a bucket of water saying, this does not look as alluring as the pizza with extra cheese and extra pepperoni and, thick crust that you're eating every day that you call your politics, which, by the way, now I'm hungry. This does not look as appealing. Yeah. But this will sustain you for longer than that. When that goes away, the effects of this will still be around, and they'll sustain you. Well, who do you think you are? You don't know anything about it. Okay, yeah, because you've only ever had that thick crust, extra cheese, pepperoni pizza, and therefore you think no other diet exists beyond that. Anyone who tries to suggest it is the weird one. When in all reality, you're the odd one because you're the one limiting yourself. When in all reality, there are many more ways. There are many more ways to sort of skin a cat, so to speak. And don't skin cats, guys. I love cats. My cat's sitting. Right now, he's sitting over there sleeping. Don't do that. I love cats, but it's an expression.
Yeah. For our final topic, I wanted to maybe hone in because it's in the news lately. The prospects of AOC potentially becoming a U.S. senator in the future. And then in the meantime, we have Mandami doing well in the polls in New York. So it's a continuing topic of what we're trying to, when we try to look at the left in a microscope and see beyond the corporate Democrats, see this really camp of democratic socialists, Marxists, etc. What are your thoughts on those prospects and the fact that something that has been an alarming faction is certainly growing and could get more power?
Well, I think a few things. So, okay. AOC, let's start with her. I am really perplexed at the amount of people who lack the ability to understand how diverse interest is. Because there are a lot of people that are saying, how could AOC possibly be doing this well? She said she's not very smart, all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But interest is dynamic. The same impulse in man that generates an affection for somebody like Donald Trump is the same impulse worked in a different direction that generates an interest for somebody like Bernie Sanders or AOC. What matters is not the impulse. What matters is what's informing the impulse, which means that interest, the idea of having an interest in something, is very dynamic. It has many different forms and faces. And I think that a subset of the culture is at a point where if someone can embody their ideology in a distilled form and put it with the right packaging, they'll go ahead and follow that person. And I think AOC's rise to power is resting solely on that phenomenon. I think in a meritorious society, she would not have the position she has. Mm-hmm. I think even among socialists, there are socialists who are much more educated and better well-studied in their own ideology than she is. It's pure interest captured by ideological desire. That's it. People try making it about her appearance. It doesn't have crap to do with her appearance. And by the way, people that are so obsessed with aesthetics, I have to say this to you. Mm-hmm. Please break out of your frame, break out of your, out of the prison of your desire, please. Because even though you're possessed with this fascination with how attractive somebody in the public square looks, that does not mean everyone else is thinking on the same base primal level that you are. Please break out of that, please.
Right, it's a fixation.
Yeah, it's like I want to say something very crude, but I also have people watching here who I respect, and I don't want to be disrespectful. But I really, really get annoyed with people who believe that their base desires, that everyone thinks in their base desires the same way they do.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of pretty people in politics. Not all of them obtain the same success as AOC does. How do you explain that if it's appearance primarily?
Yeah, my mind definitely doesn't go to that fixation. It goes more to this phenomena of like left-wing populism. Oh, I
Yes.
was a bartender. I know the struggles. I'm going to represent you
Yes.
guys instead of this old fart, which is essentially what happened to
Yes.
AOC.
Yes. Yes. It's proximity to the people paired with this kind of conviction and the sort of wickedness of the system that AOC used to create a compelling political career. That's all. That's all. And the fact that so many people are not understanding this is boggles my mind. I'm like, this is why the right is in such a bad spot, because so many of you cannot look beyond your lower regions when you try to think. Just to be crude about it, it just is like it's like really just stop it. It's ridiculous.
It's
right. No one ever asked about Margaret Thatcher's appearance or Ronald Reagan's appearance. They asked about their ethos, and AOC's ethos gives her a lot of credibility with a lot of people, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to defeat your enemy, you've got to understand your enemy. So that's AOC. Mamdani is a different case.
Yeah.
Now, Mamdani is an educated, he is intelligent, and he is rather lethal in terms of what he has the fortitude of mind to do if he gets the mayoral position, which seems increasingly likely. I saw that debate. It was a disaster. It was just actually that New York City mayoral debate reminded me of exactly why I think corporate media shouldn't be moderating any of these debates. Because the format is so static, it does not actually give the candidates an ability to substantively explain their positions beyond sound bites, and the moderators are too invasive.
I think New York Times was one of the moderators.
Yeah,
doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, too invasive. The debate is not about the moderators. The debate is about the statesman's vision for the people.
Right.
So to deprive me of a holistic account of that vision is to then therefore deprive me of the ability to make a reasoned decision in some way, shape, or form of who I wish to pick to represent me, which then undermines the consent of the governed, which then undermines the classically Republican system. So in a certain way, these moderators, by being interventionists in their tactics, are undermining the very process they claim to be helping, the electoral process. I find that an interesting observation. Right?
It's interesting, yeah.
Very, very interesting. I've always hated the invasiveness of some of these moderators.
Yeah, you'd prefer it much more free and open, right?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. What's that debate that happened? I think it was between Trump and was it Harris? There was like several debates, but there was like one. I think the first one actually that happened. The first one. There was actually only one debate, if I remember right. I think the moderator was like more laissez-faire. There was one debate where the moderator was laissez-faire, whether it be with Trump and Harris or with Obama and Romney. I'm trying to think of it. But
I know an example from Hollywood media in the West Wing. They the two main characters, they called it a more like Lincoln Douglas style debate.
Yeah. That's a much better kind of model, in my opinion, to follow for the cultivation of a informed citizenry, more so than this sterile corporate soundbite type culture that we have going on right now. Just a thought. But so anyway, Mamdani. Yeah. Mamdani is interesting because he knows exactly what his socialist project entails. He packages it in a way that specifically speaks to the aggrieved person in the lower classes. And then he convinces, and then by his presence and also by his posture, he manages to distinguish himself in a rather emotionally powerful way from somebody like Cuomo, from the sort of old guard of progressive politics, which then builds around him a shield of invulnerability that makes him virtually unstoppable in his rise. He has something about him that
I agree.
Unfortunately taps into, again, that problem of interest talked about. Problem of interest taps into that problem of interest and magnifies it to the 10th degree. And that makes his candidacy all the more powerful, unfortunately, because the ideas he's pushing are just corrosive to any sound civil society. I mean, taking like having government come in and manage grocery stores to fix prices, rent controls, all this stuff, just absolutely corrosive to organic human relationships. An attempt to impose will over long-standing matters that are actually naturally occurring and can't be artificially adjusted by the hand of the statesman. Just obviously a lot of bad stuff with Mamdani. But his posture and his presence combined make any consideration of that issue seem in the background, and those two things at the forefront. So I think if Mamdani was a U.S. citizen, I would say he would have a shot of being president one day, more so than AOC. But Mamdani is not a U.S. citizen, not a natural-born U.S. citizen at least. So he will not have that ability.
Because he's from Uganda? Trying to recall.
Yeah, he's from Africa. Yeah. So he won't have he will never have that ability unless we change the Constitution, which I don't think is going to happen. So AOC appears to be the torchbearer for future progressive presidential politics. If she can sustain herself in a body like the Senate, if she can refine herself, I think you could easily see her become the de facto national spokeswoman for grassroots progressivism. Because she's not right now, contrary to popular belief. She's in the presence of those spokespeople, right? I would say people like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are those spokespeople right now. Mm-hmm. But she's not herself the singular or de facto person. So she possibly could become that if she refines herself. But right now, she's sustained purely by interest, not by her own merits. And that's unfortunate. And that is a unfortunate prospect for a civil society that cultivates statesmen who are supposed to serve, not perform.
I think the Republican candidate Sliwa, I think he brought up the point that there was a socialist mayor of New York before. But it's interesting because for much of New York's recent history, from the 90s and early 2000s, there was a decent like center-right movement and in coalition with independents, and there used to be an independence party. And it's interesting to see this resurgence of left labor parties, really like in the primaries, just going all out and then trying to package themselves as center left. That was the impression I got recently. Just taking this democratic socialism and trying to package it as mainstream come the general election. And it's we'll have to see. Yeah,
certainly will. Absolutely, it'll be a very interesting thing to observe.
Yeah, this is like the pre-midterms. Frankly, these local elections and some state elections coming up, Virginia and New Jersey as well. So yeah.
But what are your predictions? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think the Republicans are going to gain control of the government again? What's going to happen in your opinion?
Of the governorships? It's hard
governorships and also on the congressional level. I'm curious because I'm seeing a lot of predictions. I'm not quite sure what to believe.
It's possible the Democrats, so the two governors' races that are up, obviously it's possible, but it's even probable that they could sweep in both New Jersey and Virginia. And it occurred to me, like we don't want this to happen, but there could be a version where the East Coast states are just incredibly democratic because of all the mass populations and the propaganda that you can just feed to big cities. I think that was something that we were kind of even discussing before, that these big cities are full of these like facade intellectuals, right? People that think that they understand the world and they power these democratic primaries. And it used to be there was like a boss party system and things like that. And now it's just, the average liberal can fuel some of these big states. So that does concern me. And it's interesting to see, Trump shattered the blue wall in the working states of the Midwest. And it's interesting to see, as our political geography shifts. I was thinking about it even more recently, how it's always been a part of U.S. politics, the geography to it, right? When the North was the industrial and the South was the more agrarian, and how we
Yeah.
had it when we thought of the because I was reading some of the history of just some of the basic stuff that people learn in primary school and education. That Jefferson's party was very agrarian and things like
It
that.
was. There's a reason for that too.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that
So
because
it's
a connection with the
yeah.
land signified a kind of number one, ownership, and number two, localism. So
Mm,
the agrarian republic is built around the land. It's not built in defiance to the land. And unfortunately, I think in the pursuit of progress, we've gotten away from material things and we've gone towards more disembodied things.
mm,
And that has, I think, turned our understanding of property on its head, turned our understanding of proportionality and the importance of locality to just politics on its head. It's done a lot of bad things that I think are ultimately destructive to our republic.
right. Well said.
Sorry, go on.
No. I think I think we covered a decent amount. I'm trying to think of if I had any. I may have lost my train of thought, but that's fine. I think maybe we were covering the majority of it.
Yeah. Well, I do want to, before we
Yeah.
continue, I want to, Bob put another super
Yeah,
chat
go
here.
ahead.
Again, thank you so much for the money. I appreciate it. So the concern for optics is a dead end. The enemies of freedom will always lie and claim it's bad optics, no matter what. Well, I agree with you. They will certainly claim that. Having said that, I do believe, and here's where I'll push back a little bit. When it comes to packaging morally sound positions, you never compromise the substance in favor of optics. The substance ought to take precedence over any consideration of optics or appearances. Having said that, when optics compromise the substance of a morally sound position, that position becomes unappealing to those who may not be able to look beyond how things appear. America has gone into some very unfortunate directions due to its citizens not being able to look beyond the immediate story and dig deeper. I'm not talking about in a conspiratorial sense. I'm talking about in a civic sense. And if optics create a challenge to further inquiry, then the optics, I think, are a rather morally significant thing to consider. So I'm not necessarily worried about how those who are always uncharitable will perceive optics, because they're not the subject of my claim in the first place. I'm worried about how those who are uninformed or who are not as informed as you or I may be might perceive optics and mistake optics for the moral integrity of a particular position, when in all reality, a particular position can be morally right, but the way that it's delivered is unsound, and that then therefore compromises it. So if you were to just show them how the position is good and the means are various and infinite, they would agree with you on the position, and the means become secondary. That is my goal. And as a civic conservative, that's my interest as well. But again, thank you for the money. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the pushback as well. We don't grow or refine ourselves by agreements and yes men. We grow and refine ourselves by challenging what we believe, testing our ideas against what is observable and what is true according to first principles, and then building from the conclusions of that particular process. So again, thank you so much for the money and the pushback. Any thoughts on that, Nikoji?
Yeah, I have maybe a similar reaction. I do think that the nature of politics is always going to come down to optics to some degree, whether we would prefer it or not, just in our modern societies, because I believe that there's a lot of science in campaigning that is essentially like marketing. It's like marketing to the public, and of course we would prefer it to be just policy, but I think there is some unfortunate truth that a lot of it is spent with optics. A lot of it is spent in perfecting appearance And I do think that there are certain truths in our U.S. politics. The fact that we've had Reagan and Trump, both from the media establishments, having all that name recognition certainly helps. It's without a doubt that there are certain like political truths in how modern campaigning works. Maybe in the past it was if you were a great general that gave you a lot of credit. Now we're seeing more of this even outside of the US, like Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky, having made a name in media, is now a president. So I think the fact that we're seeing a lot of that in our modern ages goes to show that as much as we prefer it to be beyond optics, there's always going to be some of that, and I think that's probably at some level a very human thing, that for us to have some optics in the equation. But the goal is to go beyond it. That's still the goal.
It is the goal. It is the goal. And we go beyond it by teaching people to value substance more than appearance, but also understanding that a lot of people don't have the toolkit to look beyond appearance into substance. So we have to meet them where they are and take them a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we have to handle that personally. So
yeah,
no, I think we've covered a lot of good ground today. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of touch on or talk about in our closing here?
I was a little surprised, I guess with just a quick deep dive into world developments. I was a little surprised to see that Zelensky agreed to meet with Trump and Putin. And I'm wondering if he's feeling a lot of pressure, maybe I think domestically he was feeling some pressure, but maybe even internationally.
Yeah.
Because I remember there was a time when it was more the thought process, like I would never meet with a war criminal.
Yeah.
That was more of the it's interesting how much Trump can kind of change dynamics in the world arena and how a lot of people underestimate him.
Yeah, Russia was supposed to run out of the ability to fight years ago, according to projections and the analysts that were talking to us at the beginning of the war. But the exact opposite has happened, and it's just been a constant war of attrition on both sides. And it does not look like that Ukraine, in the absence of American and European arms, would actually be able to sustain themselves against this any further. And I think both sides are feeling the kind of sting of that. I mean, Europe did deplete a great majority of its arms reserves, and America also did the same thing as well in giving the foreign aid over to Ukraine. So I think Trump has a material interest in trying to mediate this. Also, I think he also has a more legacy-focused interest.
Right.
He wants to establish himself as the peacetime or the president who brought peace to impossible situations. And the fact that he controls the strings and how much help Ukraine gets gives an extra incentive for Zelensky to come to the table and be willing to negotiate. So I think it's a confluence of factors that will be very interesting to watch play out. Look, the deal between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Hamas rather, it lasted for a little bit, then it broke down.
Yeah.
So Trump is even more incentivized to get something that'll last.
Yeah.
And I think the prospect of a deal between Ukraine and Russia, brokered by Trump, is a little bit more sustainable than a deal between Hamas and Israel, even though there are tensions on both sides, amongst both sides. The region around Israel has always been unstable, and it lends itself toward conflict. There have been periods of tension between Ukraine and Russia where they were diplomatically and rhetorically at each other's throats, but no weapons were fired for long same periods of time. So I believe there is a prospect for at least a somewhat lasting peace, even if it's only like a few years, that Trump sees as within his reach. So who knows? Maybe we'll be able to close the book on that bloody chapter.
Yeah, it's an interesting notion that Russia Ukraine is in some ways, it's maybe a heavier war, but it's at
Yeah,
some levels less complicated than
I
Israel
think so.
Palestine. Yeah, I
I,
think
I
so
would
too.
say so. I would say so because you don't have the religious elements as much.
Yeah,
I mean, there's some of that. I mean, there is some of that there with Putin and his fascination with orthodoxy and that kind of stuff. But I don't think that is what generated this whole thing.
yeah.
I think the tensions for this whole thing are much more recent compared to Israel Palestine. Those tensions are ancient,
And
and
Israel
if
Palestine having nationalism without, like on the Palestinian side, without a state
yeah,
that's been universally recognized, it's a kind of can of worms.
yeah, yeah. So I think Trump is going to have a much easier time for that reason dealing with that situation. Um, but only time will tell.
Yeah.
I'm an optimist. I'm hoping that will happen. Um, but hey, look, maybe this negotiation will be fruitful. Who knows?
Mhm.
Who knows?
All we
What do
can
you
do
think?
is hope. Yeah, yeah. I think it's good that the living hostages were released, and there's a lot of behind the scenes that Trump's advisors had to work on. So at some level, it was a success in terms of hostage releases, and I think people will be grateful for that. But the conflict will still remain, and I think that's what everyone kind of knew.
Yeah. Look, getting the hostages was a massive victory for Trump and for their families of those hostages as well. Getting the remains of several ones that are deceased was also a massive victory. So that's one thing that nobody can take away from the president. I'll give him that much.
Right.
But prospect that this is going to be a lasting peace. I was skeptical the moment I heard that. I'm like, nope, that's not going to happen. Not because I'm pessimistic, but because I understand. I understand at least in part the region. I understand the region in part, and I understand how ancient that tension between the two classes are. And you don't just negotiate that tension away. Arguably, that tension can't be removed by anything because both sides are assured in their own correctness. And it's very hard to convince somebody who believes they are correct, who believes that that land is their land by divine right or by ancestral right or whatever, to reverse course because that deeply rooted conviction it is burrowed into the very soil of their identity as a person. So it's not a mere matter of politics. Anyone can hold a political position. It's a mere matter. It's a big matter of tradition and identity and self. And
Hmm.
these are things that can't just be negotiated away by some guy from a continent thousands of miles away.
Yeah,
These are things that are long lasting.
I
So
agree.
I really I do question the wisdom of him going to the Knesset the way he did and making those big proclamations because it set himself up for total responsibility if things didn't go well. And
Yeah,
people are already criticizing him and trying to blame him for things not going well. So I think he should have celebrated the hostages coming home, but he should have been more restrained in his rhetoric and less prematurely celebratory of the
yeah,
whole thing being settled.
yeah. I don't know if you would process that wisdom, but yeah, at least something for us to chew on.
I mean, yeah, I just
Something
it's
for us to hope in future
yeah,
leaders.
yeah, absolutely. Look, so 2026 is happening soon. And by the way, speaking of 2026, maybe we'll talk about this off the air, but it'd be very cool to have like a moral panic New Year's Eve stream. That'd be very cool to
True.
have. That'd be very cool to have. Um, we'll think about it. But as 2026 comes around, um, we're going to hear more talk about 2028. And by the time 2027 is here, that the campaign will already be in full swing.
It's true. Yeah. Be debate
So,
season.
yeah. So I'm very curious to see how all of this plays out. I'm very curious to see the formation of the Republican Party in the absence of Donald Trump. Very curious to see what all that means. And hopefully by that time, the pensive cohort will be in full swing, and it'll be powerful, and it'll be a force on the right, a subculture on the right, and we'll have the ability to, to influence our country in a well-ordered first principles rooted way. And hopefully that'll bleed into the kind of people we decide are worthy of being president of the United States.
Yeah.
That's my ambition.
Yeah, I think there's going to be hopefully some soul searching on the right. Yeah.
Me too. And we can leave that there.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. But all right, Mr. Nikoji.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
Mainly 2 words: stay pensive.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.